The Canadian Pacific Railway. Construction began on the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1881. It would eventually connect Canada by rail from coast to coast. The railway helped move many new settlers out to the prairies and allowed the Northwest Mounted Police to move quickly when they needed to. So, the Canadian Pacific Railway kind of began as a dream of John A. Macdonald, our first prime minister. And it was also a condition of some of the Western provinces joining Confederation was that they wanted to be connected by rail. But there were some challenges behind this because if you think about what you've learned about Canada's physical geography and landscape this year, you know there's things like muskeg and rock in the Canadian Shield, and there's those tall, steep, rocky mountains in the Cordillera. So building a railway wouldn't necessarily be an easy task. The first thing they needed to do was decide a route. To do this, they sent surveyors out into the wild to collect information. And as they traveled across the country, they took measurements and they began to think about what the best route would be and how they would cross, especially those rocky mountains. So surveyors were really important. But we know the railway couldn't have been built without the workers. And these workers faced terrible, harsh working conditions. They risked their lives in accidents. They were at risk of disease. There wasn't enough food. They were malnourished. And to top it off, they were paid very, very little to work in these very dangerous conditions. And a lot of these workers were foreign immigrants. They came from China, Italy, and Sweden. And like I said, the conditions were awful. In one 80-kilometer stretch in the Canadian Shield, 30 workers died in explosions because they would use dynamite to blow up the rock, and it was really dangerous, especially in the Canadian Shield. There's granite, which is very strong, so that didn't end well. And also in the mountains, the explosions would cause avalanches and rock slides, which were known to actually cover the entire work camps. So these explosions were very dangerous. The workers were also working on steep cliffs. It just wasn't easy work at all. So the railway had a lot of impacts on Canada. Some of the benefits included we were able to transport products across Canada, so our grain and things like that. The West was opened up to tourism and new immigration. Before, to travel west, you'd have to go down through the United States, and now you could just head straight across. And bigger cities grew along the railway lines, but there were also some very negative things that occurred because of the railway. Cities that weren't along the rail line were often turned into ghost towns because people didn't travel there. And this negative impact of the railway definitely extended to the First Nations and Métis people that were living in Canada at the time. The railway destroyed most of the bison living on the prairies, which many nations relied on for their food. So this impacted their way of life. Their main food source was now gone. Also, new settlers came out west on the trains, and the government sold them land that the First Nations had been living on for a really long time. So the First Nations were moved on to reserves and lost much of their traditional land because of this immigration out west. So the railway had a lot of implications for a lot of people, and they weren't always positive.